Hot Water History, episode 179. Dark Notes is back by popular demand. We have our third one. First one, To Kill a Mockingbird. Second one, Wolf in the Deep, I believe. Raphael Sims, story of
Yes.
him.
Mm-hmm.
And the third one, I've been wanting this one, Frank Lloyd Wright, who, if you talk about Frank Lloyd Wright in a negative manner, especially in Oak Park and potentially surrounding suburbs, people might look at you funny. But
Godlike status. Godlike status.
Rich, we have a special guest who's back. Who do we got?
Second time around, we're so pleased to have Sam Roche back. Sam is an architect he used to work in our dear fair city of Chicago, but has since relocated back to New York. And Sam, what's the name of your firm again?
It's called Stevenson Roach.
Stevenson Roche. And we're so happy to have him because he's going to lend his considerable expertise. Charlie and I, we are fond of looking at buildings and spouting out layman's terms about what we find and appreciate, or the lack thereof to appreciate, in structures. And Sam has helped us to not only will help us to refine our tastes. I know he's done that for me. In fact, we last time you were in for a visit, Sam, we just sort of walked around Bridgeport and we looked at some good buildings, and you were just filling my mind with so much detail and insight. I couldn't help but I didn't hesitate to say, well, if we're going to have a Dark Notes episode on Frank Lloyd Wright, who better to call upon than our architectural master here?
It's my pleasure.
Thanks. What I thought we'd do is go through a little bit of the biographical on Frank Lloyd Wright, and then beyond that, talk a little bit about the paucity of works that are at all approaching criticism of him. They're all salutary and very laudatory of his contributions. There are some works that are a bit critical of the undue influence of the Prairie School, but not necessarily Wright himself. He's always considered to be a genius, in oftentimes the moniker of greatest architect, American architect of the 20th century is ascribed to him in the works that I've been looking at and perusing. Let's go into that, giving some background, a look at his worldview as to how his worldview, experience, even his philosophies and ideologies had an impression upon his architecture. I hope Sam will further inform us about that. And then we could take a look at the buildings themselves and his contributions. So I hope everybody's on board with that. Let me just give you again some basic biographical notes here that I was able to bullet point and be able to reference here. So he was born on June 8th, so June 8th, 1867 in Richland Center, Wisconsin. And he was raised, interestingly enough, in a Unitarian family with a very strong interest that came from his mother in transcendentalism and natural theology and philosophy. He studied engineering briefly at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1885 and 1886, and then he matriculated on to Chicago in 1887, and he began working immediately for architects Joseph Lyman Silsby and Louis Sullivan. And it was there that he started to develop his what is called organic architecture philosophy, which, Sam, if you could please correct me if I'm wrong. This is one of the major attributes that is ascribed to his work, namely that he wanted to have his buildings mix in with natural elements around them and often convey elements of nature in the actual structures. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. He had an immense connection with what eventually became known as, and this was both when he was not very well known and then became famous. He had a, as I said, very important connection with the Theosophical Society. And for those who are not aware of what Theosophy is and what the Theosophical Society promotes, essentially, Wright's mother, her name was Anna Lloyd Jones. She was the one who ingrained in him this interest in spiritual movements. Think a lot of the 19th century spiritual movements that surrounded things like the women's suffrage efforts, and then Unitarianism, and furthermore, transcendental thought. So when Percy Bysshe Shelley is writing in England, or I'm trying to think of other transcendentalists, even Thoreau here, and they're trying to move beyond the post-French Revolutionary re-embracing of traditional mystical religions especially Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy and Christianity, and moved back into a very much more rational, almost we could call it Jansenistic and anti-emotional type of. We're not even going to call it. It's not a religion per se. It's simply a worldview with its own epistemology and cosmology and outlook on life. What is that outlook on life among the Theosophes? They are very Gnostic. Anyone who's read the fathers of the church from Clement all the way through to, well, Athanasius and beyond, even to St. John Damascene, will recognize that this is very Gnostic. Namely, that Gnostics believed that there was a hidden knowledge, gnosis, that could be gleaned, and this hidden knowledge had inserted itself or injected itself into a variety of different faith traditions. And then it was the job of the philosoph or the Theosophes or the Gnostics to take those hidden symbolic, often Platonic typology or types and bring them into a greater worldview that leads to, yes, communing with nature and a greater connection to it. So if this sounds very Eastern, also in the context of New Age theology, you're pretty much on that. So he was a major player in the advent of Chicago's Theosophical Society. The headquarters of the World Theosophical Society is located just in a Chicago suburb here in Wheaton, which is odd because Wheaton is often associated with Christian evangelicalism. And I'm wondering if they chose that site to be a thorn in the side of the more fundamentalist evangelicals in the area. So it blended Eastern and Western mysticism, as I said, and this indeed influenced Wright's architectural philosophy, where unity with nature and geometric purity was to be emphasized. Point of fact, the Theosophical Society symbol is a hexagon, and hexagons are thought to convey in theology and philosophy and various world religions perfection and the attainment of enlightenment in unity with nature. His prairie school was, for example, the Robbie House in Hyde Park here in Chicago, reflective of the theosophical principles of organic unity with open floor plans and natural materials symbolizing spiritual interconnectedness. He went on to found what he called Taliesin, which was in 1911 this utopian community in Wisconsin, where he was from. And the people who would go to live, commune, and retreat there were called upon to practice holistic living and bring their artistic expressions and works into the spirituality of theosophy. That was the goal. And he worked there, by the way, it was a workplace for him all the way till his death in 1959. About his fame as an architect, he designed over 1,000 structures. I didn't know he was that prolific, Sam, but I guess he was. Including Unity Temple in 1908, Falling Water in 1935, and the Guggenheim Museum is that New York, the Guggenheim, or is that
Yeah,
another location?
it's in
Okay,
New York.
got it. There are more than one Guggenheims, right? Or is that just the most famous one?
There, there, there are more. There's more than one. Yeah, there's one
Okay,
in Spain, but this is the original museum.
gotcha. In his personal life, he was married 3 times. He faced numerous scandals, financial and otherwise. He had financial struggles himself, which is interesting enough when you look at the biographies, the most prominent biographies of Frank Lloyd Wright. They really step around the financial struggles and any of the scandals that he faced in terms of trying to, I won't say shake down friends or neighbors or people who he deemed as allies in the theosophy, in other words, in other areas, but they kind of skip around that. And then he maintained a lifelong.
Wait.
Oh,
We're skipping around this as well. You know why the first marriage ended, right?
no.
So he left.
Oh, she died, right? She was
No,
murdered.
no. That's another
There was
interesting
another,
case.
a woman was murdered
Taliesin.
at Taliesin. Yes,
So that was one of his mistresses. His first
Okay.
wife, he had 6 children with and left for one of his clients' wives.
that's right. That's right. Yes, right. Hmm. So, and maybe you could see why these ideas of theosophy would condition him in such a way so as to excuse what would be considered in traditional circles terrible sins and mortal transgressions. Yeah. Thanks, Charlie, for reminding me of that. And I am skipping along here for brevity's sake. He maintained a lifelong interest in mystical and philosophical ideas, which were very much linked to Gnosticism, Arametical magic, and the like. And then finally, he continued working all the way till his death in April of 1959. And the notes here end by just stating that, regardless of the theosophical principles that influenced clearly the way he subtly shaped his vision of architecture, he's considered still, regardless of whether you agree with his philosophies and theological outlook, the one of the greatest, if not the greatest architects in the 20th century and 19th century as well. So there you go. Any points for clarification there, gentlemen? Or additions? Charlie?
I think the personal stuff we gotta dive into more. This guy seems like a total jerk. I'm not gonna lie.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, we mentioned the leaving the six kids. I wrote some notes down too.
Uh-huh.
Leaving the wife and six kids, and then his third wife, who he also met while she was still married, and then you mentioned the money part, but basically, underbidding projects, sometimes
Mm.
didn't pay his workers or creditors on time,
Yes.
right? So that as well. And then just the overall, I found a good Frank Lloyd Wright quote. Early in life, I had to choose between honest arrogance and hypocritical humility. I chose arrogance.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So that it sounds like he took credit for some of the ideas of his apprentices, especially those they had at the Towson. And then,
Which is interesting because the when I have looked at off the beaten path critiques of him, they say, and maybe Sam, you're familiar with these, that they attribute, if the people aren't fans of Frank Lloyd Wright or think his influence is outdue and inordinate, they say, well, all the genius that he supposedly had in terms of innovation and vision, and then carrying out the vision in terms of actual structures, really he derived from Sullivan,
Right.
and that Sullivan's the real genius. And what's funny about that is because whenever you study Sullivan, that is to say Louis Sullivan, the architect, you can't, even though he built tremendous structures, and from my mind, from all the way from the agricultural building at the World's Fair all the way to the Auditorium Theater in Chicago, they just, I think those are immaculate buildings and innovative, but and really cool, for lacking a better term. But you can't escape. Everyone brings up that he was a drunkard and a louse, and but it seems as though those claims or attributes Frank Lloyd Wright and his legacy is able to evade, and it's stuck to Sullivan. I wonder why that is.
and then I know Sam's going to get more into the actual designs of buildings,
Hmm.
but at least I didn't know this, but falling water had serious water damage and wasn't great structurally that they
Yeah,
had
it has
they had
structural problems because it has these big cantilevered terraces, meaning they're only they're basically attached at one end, so they're sort of hanging out into space. Spans
Mm,
were too great; they started to the terraces
they
started
dip.
to sag over time.
Hmm. Okay.
and then
Although
some
I
of his
say that's not unusual for sort of innovative architecture in the 20th century because a lot of it, whoever made, in every case was based on sort of pushing the envelope. So this is what's going to happen, right? In all these
Sure.
cases.
Sure. And those innovators and those who pushed the envelope, were they just lacking in consideration about the materials that were to be needed if you're going to have those levered designs? Or would
I,
it,
I think they would just say, I'm guessing, but I think they would say that what was important was to make the new forms and
Mhm.
the materials could be brought along to do that. And
Yes.
if there's some experimentation along the way, that's fine.
Excellent. So, Sam, do you want to take us through some of the visuals you have and then maybe get into and analyze what his contributions were from an architectural perspective?
Yeah, but just before we do that, just a couple of little comments on his biography from the point of view of an architect. Um, First, I'll just say that his relationship with Sullivan is fictionalized in The Fountainhead. The
Yes, it is. That's
Yeah,
right.
the
I didn't even
the
think of that.
protagonist Howard Work is a sort of composite, but there's a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright in him,
Mm-hmm.
and I can't remember what his mentor's name was, but there's a lot of Sullivan in him,
Gotcha.
and at least among architects, I mean, both these men are famous for their drawings. They both made beautiful drawings. We're going to look at one of Wright's, but Sullivan's are particularly fine. And Sullivan had a system for designing ornament that he presented in a very clear graphic way, very beautiful. Is Frank Lloyd, are they? It's hard to say he's more talented or skilled than Frank Lloyd Wright, because Frank Lloyd Wright, besides being extremely prolific and hardworking, was very talented. He made nice drawings. I think one of the main differences between the two, as so often happens in the practice of architecture, has to do with probably their public presentation and their different capacities for self-promotion.
Yes.
It still pertains that the most successful architects are the biggest self-promoters. They're the biggest marketers. So Frank Lloyd Wright was, I don't know so much about Sullivan in that capacity. He had a partner named Dankmar Adler and Sullivan. And Adler was sort of the business partner, and Sullivan was the designer. And my sense is that Sullivan was a designer through and through, and Wright was a designer and an impresario. So I think I think that goes a long way to explain why one failed and one succeeded.
Well put.
With though a kind of, we'll talk more about Frank Lloyd Wright's kind of success, but the fact is he was a very famous American architect practicing a very certain style that he would call modernism, but the dominant movement, which was imported European modernism, was something else, was something different.
I see.
So it's almost like for most of his career, he was in the shadow of European modernism.
Did he, from your study of him, was he aware of that heritage?
Yeah, he regarded, I think he would, he had contempt for European import modernism mostly.
Okay. Is there an architect who is a standout of European import modernism?
Yeah, the main one in America is Mies van der Rohe.
Oh, okay. There you go.
With another Chicago connection. All these people have Chicago connections. Mies van der Rohe came from Germany, where he was director of the Bauhaus, which is the school of architecture and crafts in Germany, basically industrialized design and product design and architecture. And he came to Chicago to be the head of the architecture school at IIT, Illinois Institute of Technology, and then he started his practice in Chicago as well.
Right.
So his buildings in Chicago, the Federal Center, the old IBM building, sort of stately glass boxes would be his basic style.
Almost brutalist, right?
Yeah, I just say cold and machined. And that's the main difference with Frank Lloyd Wright, who would be from the earth, right? It's almost like it's made of, it's brought out of the earth.
Well said. So that there's no real naturalism at all within the European school?
I just say it's industrialized craft versus folk craft at some level. And Frank Lloyd Wright, or industrialized design versus craft. Frank Lloyd Wright represents the craft tradition.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. You want to show us some buildings here, Charlie?
I'll pull it up.
Hey, and let's go right to the last one, which is Unity Temple. And can you go to the one before, which is the outside view?
I'm gonna make this bigger and see if we stay. Yeah.
Take up the whole screen.
There you go.
So do y'all recognize this building?
Yes. Right,
So
Oak Park.
Yeah.
Meanwhile in Oak Park.
I mean, this is probably Frank Lloyd Wright's great civic monument in Oak Park, and it's Unity Temple. And another thing that we might mention is the great influence of his mother on his career. Charlie, were you saying that she was from was her father a minister, and was he a Unitarian minister?
I know she was a Unitarian. I'm not sure about her father, but
because
she was.
The Lloyd Joneses, I believe, somewhere in there is a Unitarian clergy, although they wouldn't call it clergy, but Unitarian minister somewhere. So this commission would be near and dear to Frank Lloyd Wright's heart, right? His mother envisioned for him that he'd be an architect from his childhood.
Wow.
Wow.
So there's a sense in which, he's a bit of a child prodigy, which doesn't really happen so often in architecture, but I think he's about as close as you can have to that. A very strongly influential parent with an idea about what her child should be. So first question about this building is, what does it look like to y'all?
It reminds me of the wedding cake in Rome a little bit. But
Oh,
I noticed that the pillars look like trees.
yeah.
Charlie, thoughts?
This is weird to say, but it looks like this map on Super Smash Bros. On the Wii. But I don't think that's what you thought I was going to say.
That was based on this.
Yeah, yeah.
Does it look like a church?
It looks kind of like the Field Museum a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
And I think it looks much more like the extension of a Roman temple than anything that would resemble a church in either the Gothic or Romanesque styles.
If you can imagine what the churches looked like in Oak Park, they would have
Mhm.
been, sort of provincial versions of English churches with steeple,
Mm-hmm.
right? So in that context, this couldn't be more different.
Right.
To me, it looks very much like an auditorium building or two of them,
Yes.
which is to say it looks civic rather than sacred,
Very true.
right?
Yes.
It does look a little bit like the Field Museum in the sense that it has these sort of columns and a strong cornice line, which is the horizontal that the columns are holding up, but it doesn't look classical.
Mm-mm.
It looks more like Viennese secessionism, which is late 19th century, early 20th century sort of Art Nouveau inspired architecture. But the main, and I think that's very typical of his early style here. But the main thing I want to emphasize is that it flouts convention for sacred buildings.
Yes.
And I think the Unitarians would be very happy with that. They would say, well, that we're not the usual church.
It is very it's if there was a rationality in structure that, like you said, isn't brutalist or of the European school or modernist school, this would be a great example of that. Because
Yeah.
it does have elements of nature
Yes.
and it works within the natural space, but it is, as you pointed out, Sam, so far afield from what we would, especially at the time in 1906 as it was constructed and designed before that and constructed, such a far cry from what would be considered a sacred space or liturgical space in a traditional religious setting or for that structure.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And Charlie, could you go to the next one? So here's the interior.
Wow.
And
Just-
what are your impressions of the interior?
Looks like a courtroom.
Yeah, of
Yes.
course, but yeah.
Absolutely a courtroom, and I, I see that it has the vertical structure, but then it has pews in the horizontal mezzanines, I suppose, or the balconies there.
Yeah.
It it almost makes me think that it reminds me of what a non-religious person who wanted civic matters of the state to impact people in the same way that monasteries with their cloisters would.
Yeah.
In other words, yeah, it's cold, it's very rational, but it harkens back to, or it makes me think of the choir stalls in a kind of Gothic nave.
To me, it also looks like an auditorium,
Yes.
which I would describe as not a sacred space. But
Mhm.
I think, Charlie, that you've hit on something by comparing it to a courtroom, which is another kind of secular, ceremonial, religious stand-in space, or interchangeable with religious space, let's say, civic space.
Yeah, and the total lack of imagery is shocking. It's all geometrical form.
Right, right. Yeah, it's in a way, it's all about the architecture. right? And
Uh,
not about what the architecture is a container for.
what do you think, Sam, he was trying to evoke in the person who entered the space?
Well, I, I think his interest in elementalism very basic forces and shapes and maybe consequently feelings is evident in the design, right? And his work has this tendency to almost the hand of the designer is very strong,
Uh,
right? And it's almost overpowering in itself. It's like a um, virtuoso performance,
I
right?
see.
But that's a funny thing for architecture because architecture is a setting for other things. So when it's too much in the foreground itself, it overpowers those things which it's really designed to serve in some sense.
Funny you say that. I see in the right corner there's a grand black piano.
Yeah,
The space is so cool. I know what I mean in its rationality that it's almost as though music doesn't belong there.
right. Yeah, it seems like a place for speaking, right?
Yes, or
Yeah,
judgment.
yeah, yeah. But I wanted to go to this one first because you opened to talking about theosophy,
Hmm.
and so I mean Unitarianism is a pretty I don't know its tenets so well except it's open to uh, other religions than Christianity, isn't that right?
Yes, and it's because its emphasis on reason, it eschewed Trinitarian theology and anything that would speak of the the escapability of the essence of God without or insofar as man could deploy his intellect in the proper way, God is far from escapable. He can be rationally deduced,
Yeah,
especially upon a. It's funny too, though, because in theosophy as well, there's also this odd mystical side that is celebrated, but it's not something that you're called to contemplate what is thought to be objective realities of God and providence, his action within the world, because that's too limiting the objectivity that is. So they do tend towards subjectivity.
right.
Um, and so this by eschewing all the traditional aspects of religion, that is, say, with a hierarchy, blood sacrifice, cults, sacramentals, for example, and the like. By doing away with that, you're left with the pure cold rationality that you see here, I think.
I'd say maybe they share also de-emphasis on the transcendent divine
Correct.
as
Right.
divine, right?
Yes.
So divine is discoverable and knowable through these other uh, things which we can connect to directly.
Correct. Yeah, so they would like to have they're very they're religious relativists in many ways,
Right.
insofar as elements that could be gleaned from global and different civilizational practices, belief systems, knowledge bases, to whatever degree it is helpful or leads the individual Unitarian to some solace, some recognition, particularly of, especially as we get into elite Unitarian circles, their own genius, productive capabilities, their own creativity. Well, then that's to be celebrated.
Yeah.
So they're very much into integrationalism and doing that. And there's always this base rejection of, again, those traditional aspects or and especially axioms that don't sound rational in traditional religion.
Well, so we can say they share a rejection
Hmm.
of traditional religion. Yeah.
For sure.
So then this is a project that I think would have lots of overlap with his theosophical interests.
To be sure.
Yeah.
And it's of interest to us, and I suspect that our that is say Charlie and my interest in Frank Lloyd Wright is that we've been looking a lot on the subject of just modernism in the church, but also modernism in society as it's reflected. And I'm reading a book that is by our friend Kennedy Hall called What Happened to Catholicism in the 20th Century. And he speaks about this both inside and outside of the Catholic Church, the reassertion, more so the infiltration of integrationists, syncretists, to the point where they're just, again, theological relativists, and they want to accept anything that anyone finds pleasing and make that acceptable, or and those who fail to or wish to exclude those influences are just rigorist, backwards, anachronistic, heathen. And so he sees this as a major point of what's happened to the church since, especially the Vatican Council, Second Vatican Council. But I was getting to why I think Frank Lloyd Wright piqued our interest to do a Dark Notes is because in a building like this, it's as though civic activity is elevated to the point of theology and religious practice.
Man the center, not God the center.
Absolutely. As you said, this is all very imminent and man put up on the same level as the divine, rather than if you were to walk into Sainte-Chapelle in Paris and recognize the distinction, the gulf that exists when we speak of the transcendental nature of God vis-a-vis man or the angels.
You know, probably the architect who I think is the greatest architect of the 20th century, and probably the greatest since Michelangelo, was an English architect named Edwin Lutyens.
Hmm.
And his wife, Emily Lutyens, was a central figure in the Theosophical movement.
Okay.
And, you know, it's hard. Lutyens himself was not a Theosophist. He designed their headquarters in London. And it's funny because this sort of, what do I want to say about is the elemental, he too practices the elemental style that Wright does, but Lutyens is a classical architect.
Mm-hmm.
And Lutyens designed very many. I guess he himself was Anglican, but he designed a Catholic cathedral for Liverpool that was begun and then abandoned. He designed at Oxford. He designed a college with a chapel. I can't remember. Campion Hall was basically the Catholic sort of presence at Oxford. The Catholic
Newman Center. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Newton Center. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think what other. He designed 2 churches in a garden suburb in England. But my point in mentioning him is that it isn't necessary to abandon. Those are all very successful religious spaces insofar as I've seen them. I haven't been into, but I can judge them. They're good spaces. I've been to the 2 churches in London. But elementalism need not abandon the central role for the divine. And so that we even have somebody else in the 20th century who was practicing at the same time with connections to theosophy, designing also in an elemental style, but with a focus on sort of traditional religious context roles for God.
Yeah. And making the civic realm and politics and the mechanizations of the state and government rise to the status of religion, I suppose, is the thing that most raised our antenna. Wouldn't you say, Charlie?
Yeah, especially in Oak Park.
Yes, exactly. So, Sam, you want to move on to different structures?
Yeah.
What other ones do you have? Do you want to pick and choose or?
Yeah, let's just move in that in reverse order here.
Okay.
And then what I want to say about what I think, go one before this one, and now one before this one, and then we'll come back to these. Okay, I think the one reason, or it's very hard to know why people become heroes, cultural heroes, or cultural
Icons.
Icons. Good. You know, there are clearly many causes, right? And Frank Lloyd Wright was always a little bit out of favor with the East Coast establishment that was bringing in European modernism for dissemination to America. All right, and then Mies van der Rohe would be a sort of subset of that enterprise, right, in Chicago. But I think that the way that the interest that those people had in Frank Lloyd Wright is that he could present an American version of modernism to this culture that would make it more palatable in this culture, and they thereby capture more of the market than they would with simply European imported modernism. So there's always a special American quality to his work, to Frank Lloyd Wright's work. All right. So this is just agricultural quarter sections of the Jeffersonian grid, right? And this is what our country looks like when we see it from the airplane. But the Jeffersonian grid is under all of our cities also that are south and west of the 13 colonies. So everything is on this grid. So Charlie, if you'll go forward. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City, which is basically his design for a very low density Jeffersonian physical environment in which everybody has, his own, little farm on the grid, right? It's based on the Jeffersonian grid. Everyone's self-sufficient. Taliesin's built on this model because Taliesin was a farm as well as a place where he worked and lived, right? So this idea that rather than everyone coming together in a big city, people live self-sufficiently over the land. So that emphasis on the land and the countryside as a working enterprise and a cultural enterprise, not just agricultural. That'd be something that's kind of classically American, right?
Yes.
Citizens in the landscape. And so, Charlie, if you go forward one more. This is his model of Broadacre City. I think it's at Taliesin.
Okay.
And you can see it's basically built on the grid.
Mm-hmm.
It's a development of the Jeffersonian grid.
What would serve as the structural center and then the point of emphasis as the focal point of this? What structure or?
Well, as in Jeffersonian ideals, the diffusion and the low density and the lack of these concentrated points, nodes, is itself the attraction.
I see.
It's like a blanket of low density civilization.
Yeah, it looks like a quilt. It's a quilt work.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. And it would be enabled by transportation, advances in transportation technology. So the rendering that was just before this one shows these little helicopters.
I saw those. Yeah.
The idea that you can get wherever you want to easily, quickly. That's how you can live like this.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have a drawing of one of Le Corbusier's designs for, say, his city of 3 million, but Le Corbusier would be another of the major proponents of European modernism. And so Le Corbusier would use transportation technology to create a huge city, right? A huge centralized, bureaucratically administered concentration of resources and people. So Frank Lloyd Wright would take those same advances in transportation technology and deploy them out over the landscape in a Jeffersonian sense instead.
And none of this is organic, or, I suppose that he would say that the layout is in keeping or consistent with natural elements. But I'm wondering if he ever considered that people don't operate, especially in a marketplace, in such a manner. So was he much more of a believer, given his architectural penchants, of a kind of collectivism? That is to say that there needed to be an element, most likely civic and bureaucratic and governmental, that would have to dictate to people in this Broadacre City model for its functioning. So go ahead.
I think it's another American characteristic of Frank Lloyd Wright that he thought he could convince people.
Yeah.
He regarded himself as a kind of prophet. And you know who he's like in that sense is Daniel Burnham.
Yes.
It's just that Burnham was a very um, he was like an organization man. He wasn't just he was someone working hand in hand with the powerful interests in Chicago in a way that was never true of Wright.
Mm-hmm.
Right, but they still have the main impetus behind the plan of Chicago was basically Burnham's ability to persuade people to adopt it.
So true. So true.
And
All right.
that happens with designers, I think,
Yeah.
because they think they can order the world, so they can if everyone will just listen, they'll tell everybody what's best, and then they believe that people will listen to them, or that will be enough.
Sure. And who's the most ready institution to be the patron but the state?
Right, right. Frank Lloyd Wright had a I'm not too well versed in this aspect of his thought, but uh, the role of the individual in a democracy was very important to him. And I have the sense that democracy was important primarily because it allowed the individual such freedom and placed its greatest emphasis on the individual. So he would like that, being an individual prophet, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Was that across class structures, or did he believe that some were going to be more equipped to do that type of work or make that type of contribution than others?
I don't, he himself had a funny class background, right? Because he was what would he be? Upper middle country gentry,
Mm-hmm.
right? So he wasn't a top down centralized power person
Sure.
or advocate. So I don't even know how important the creation of that structure was for him in his thought, right?
Right.
Whereas for Le Corbusier, it's a pyramid, and it comes down
Mhm.
from the top, and uh, the the people, the basically a priestly caste is deciding everything.
Right.
A lot like what the technologists right now. I mean, they're what do we call the transhumanists? That's Le
Mhm.
Corbusier. Right?
Yes.
We're going to tell you what you should do, and then we're going to make you do what we want you to do.
For your own good.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
What are we looking at now?
Oh, this is just an aerial view of Chicago showing it on the Jeffersonian grid, and you can see a section of the grid. If you could see the loop, you can see Grant Park on the right. If you look to the lower left of the loop, you can see a section of the grid, a quarter section
Mm-hmm.
square there. And then, Chicago is all the half mile streets in Chicago are on the grid. So Frank Lloyd Wright was engaging a reality, it was there to be improved on, right? He did a scheme for a sort of suburban quarter section that I didn't include. Actually, if we could go to the first slide, the very first one, they're not too many of them. Is this the first one? Yeah. So here are the two conditions in Chicago. The loop on the left and on the right is Riverside.
Olmsted's work, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Where Frank Lloyd Wright did several houses.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, city and country. And then the suburban landscape, which is really what is most desirable in American cities, is basically a middle condition between the countryside and the town, the city. And what do we mean by middle condition? Well, it has paved roads like the city, but they are curving, and they evoke the natural landscape. It has sewage and water drainage and street lighting like you would find in the city, but it's in a natural landscape.
Yes.
So, Charlie, if you go to the next one, this is Frank Lloyd Wright's studio in Oak Park, home and studio. So already I would consider Frank Lloyd Wright almost pretty closely concerned with the suburban side of things, right? So already I think we could imagine his home and studio as like a little tiny version of Taliesin, right? A little self-sufficient little piece of the town, of the suburb, right? Because it's not Oak Park is a suburb.
Yeah.
Right. So the character of this house is not urban, it's suburban. Right? It's a villa.
Hmm.
Can we go to the next one? There's just another. I think this is. I think that was the front, and I think this is the back. I don't know this. I've been here, but I don't know it as well as I maybe should. I think that we see in the back of this photo the same building that's in the front of the other with the big gable.
Right. I think you're right.
Yeah, but it's almost like a little suburban, almost like a little city itself, right?
Yes.
It has all these different parts where all these different things happen, right?
Mhm.
So his clients would come here, people who worked for him. I think the drafting studio is I think it's the double height space on the left.
Okay.
Yeah,
It makes me think of what Hadrian's villa would look like as an escape from Rome and its
yeah,
politics,
yeah,
on a smaller scale with much more geometric form,
yeah,
non-classical geometric forms and
yeah.
shapes.
That's a good analogy. It's a villa. Yeah,
Mhm.
again, suburban,
Yes.
and see that too is American,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because that's the American ideal is suburban settlement, right? Because the
I
cities
mean,
were always basically everyone's competing for limited commercial space in the cities, so that pushes residential settlement out to the periphery, which is where everyone wants to be anyway, because it's in the natural landscape, and we have the transportation connections that allow us to go in between one and the other every day.
right. And you're away from the fetid reality of the stockyards or the river and Bubbly
Exactly.
Creek. Okay.
Can we go to the next one? This is Frank Lloyd Wright's scheme for the McCormick Villa in Lake Forest. I think it might be in Lake Bluff, but anyway, on Lake Michigan for the Rock. One was a Rockefeller, one was a McCormick. Maybe the husband was McCormick and she was Rockefeller. And this is really his style is the prairie style. And what is
Mhm.
this is like a Lux. This is Hadrian's Villa as a prairie style building.
It evoked in me a miniature version of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon.
Totally, yes, yes. But you can imagine it's hard to separate it out from the landscape that it's in, right? It's almost like a built hill,
Yes.
right? So that's the idea that you have these big broad overhanging eaves and that they conjure or evoke the broadness of the landscape in the prairie landscape. I guess that's right. I guess that's a good analogy. But this idea that it's basically built out of the landscape, it's
Mhm.
brought out of the landscape directly. Although there's a whole lot of individual um, sort of choice in there. Like this is really one individual style, as much as you can say it looks like the prairie. To me, it looks like one designer style.
Yeah.
And then if you go to the next slide, this is what was actually built by Charles Platt, who's a very good classical architect. And we're looking from over the lake.
I see.
And so, this is the other tradition that Frank Lloyd Wright falls, stands slightly uh, in slight conflict with, I guess, or slightly in the shadow of, and that would be
Opposition.
American Beaux-Arts classical design,
Sure.
right? So the Rockefeller McCormicks chose this. This is what the rich in America wanted,
Right.
right? So that's another kind of limit on Frank Lloyd Wright's appeal or popularity or influence.
How did he take rejection? I wonder.
He said of Charles Platt, he does the wrong thing so well,
Ah.
which is
So,
interesting. The thing about Frank Lloyd Wright is that he's a talented, more than talented. He's a brilliant designer.
mhm.
I won't go into like he like the studio that we looked at is a version of a shingle style house on the East Coast, but it's way more emphatic, like prismatic, sculptural than its predecessors and influences. It's got a very strong personality as a design, and that's true of all of his work, for better or worse. But he was a very good judge, You know, he liked Lutyens. He had Lutyens. There were 3 big volumes of Lutyens' work. He had them in his office, and his students looked at them.
Oh,
So he was a good judge. He didn't agree with what Platt did, although he had an early experience, or he had an early phase where he designed some classical buildings, including one in, where is it? It might be in Riverside. I think it's the Winslow House or Henderson House. I can't remember. Anyway, he did a good classical suburban house in Chicago. But he moved on, and I suspect it was partly because he thought there was more fame to be had in personal development of a personal style.
sure.
So can we go to the next one? This is one of his Usonian houses, which is small but very grand. Again, American modernism. And let's come back to this, because just to define it, I want to look at the European modernism that was brought here. So go to the next one, which is Farnsworth House, also in Illinois, by Mies van der Rohe. So there it is. It's like a machined thing dropped in the landscape.
Yeah, very much so.
Very cold, industrial, beautiful in its way.
Yes.
Right? And then the next one. This is Glass House in New Canaan, Connecticut. So over here near me. Philip Johnson was, he's another kind of impresario. He was very close with Mies van der Rohe. He built this house on his estate in New Canaan. He was he from, I think he's from Cleveland, born to money. Did he go to Harvard? I think he went to Harvard. East Coast establishment. He's the bringer in of European modernism to America. He organized a big show at the Museum of Modern Art with Henry Russell Hitchcock, who was the great American architectural historian. And what was it called? Was it called Modernism? I can't remember. Where Frank Lloyd Wright was also shown. But the real purpose of that was to announce to everybody that European modernism is going to be the new style in America. So these are Frank Lloyd Wright's contemporaries and competitors. And so this is like a study version of the Farnsworth House, right? And so now if we'll go back to Frank Lloyd Wright's 2 before this one, how is this different from those?
There seems to be at least a nod to classical or ornamentation, but obviously different in the sense that it's just a modern pillar rather than a Corinthian column.
Yeah. In a way, it's a little bit temple-like.
Yes.
As was the McCormick proposal, and as in its way was the Unity Temple that we were looking at. You could say the Farnsworth House is temple-like, but the elements are too machined. It's more like a product than a temple, I would say.
Yeah.
So Frank Lloyd Wright is a kind of middle ground in some ways.
To be sure. All these structures, Sam, tell me if I'm way off base, but it looks as though, and the way I suppose this was purposeful and intentional, but the way they sort of emerge from the natural setting, in no way that it doesn't seek to obscure it at all, but to feature it. It's almost as though the Peruvians and the Incan Atahualpa could have lived here.
Yeah. He went through many phases. He had like many second acts. But one of his phases was textile block, like concrete masonry cast blocks with textile patterns. And those buildings look like they are Mayan buildings. So he had basically a Mayan phase.
Sure. Okay. Interesting.
And again, there is this sense that he's connected to American traditions. The genius loci, right? Genius of the place.
Yeah.
And so that would make modernism more acceptable to the people who care about being American, right? And what makes us different from other places. And then there's a whole lot of opportunity for individual expression and individual self-promotion in that brief. And it's hard to even know, like, was that at what point did that become the brief? His fame, his contribution, why he's promoted, why he's lauded, all these things have many causes. right? It's not clear when it was when and or how it came about that he ended up being the major American representative for modernism.
Right.
To make it as I would think more palatable to a people who are really not sympathetic. I mean, American people are conservative, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Conservative and anti, um, at least the republic aspect, the old Republican aspect, meaning not the party, but of the republic. They would be anti-industrial. They would be anti, you know, centralized control by European, highbrow people coming in telling them what to do. Right. So Frank Lloyd Wright could present some of those same things, but in a way that might appeal to them.
Yeah, this just looks like you dropped a WeWork in the
Yeah.
middle of the forest.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's testament to how they just never stop. They never stop shoving it down our throats. Right. So this looks like WeWork now. Like that's how now WeWork is just this on a vast scale. Like,
Right.
gonna like it. We're gonna give it to you. We're gonna keep doing it. We're gonna keep building the buildings like this. You know. So, meanwhile, this is probably this. Both this and the Farnsworth House are basically on, um, in Arcadian landscapes with nothing around them. Although that's not quite true of Farnsworth, but it is true of this house. This was his estate, right? So this is where this looks best. It's another kind of suburban focus, but this is like the machine in the garden. It's a
Yeah.
different thing, or the machine in the landscape. I don't know about Frank Lloyd Wright's. I don't know to what extent he really depended on the interests of the powerful to help him along. I think it's more a coincidence of his interests with theirs.
I see.
He had this Unitarian background. He was just always slightly outside the establishment.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Philip Johnson, whom I mentioned before, who built the glass, he is the establishment. He would be the Freemasonic, um, you know, uh,
Oligarch.
yeah, or as these people are, handmaiden to the oligarchs, right? Or
Yes.
or
Right.
or vessel for the delivery of their priorities or shaping into a cultural message.
Mm-hmm.
But there's still a lot of overlap there in their priorities. Frank Lloyd Wright is a big nature is his God, I would say, not
Yes.
God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's just fascinating. I think more than any other city, and Chicago is just a real like locus for all of these things that are special about American culture. Certainly in architecture. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that it's kind of the capital of inner America.
Nature's metropolis.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
When you were saying how the machine is placed in the, what did
yeah.
you say? Machine
The
in the
garden.
countryside? The machine in the garden?
Yeah,
I think it quite different, although I suppose unless you want to consider the city the machine, well, the official motto, the Latin motto is urbs in ordo, right? So you
right.
have a city and a garden, but it seems as though the Philip Johnsons of the world, and but not so much Wright, was interested in that coercive, we're going to hammer you with this architecture that is the machine in the garden, almost to the point where you're not going to be the plebes are not going to share in this. This is that who among the lower to middle classes would ever find that either aesthetically pleasing, the glass house, or in any way functional as an abode or as a residence?
Well, I suspect that part of its attraction to the upper classes is exactly how impractical it is and how the others would hate it. So it
Mhm.
helps them to distinguish themselves from them.
So
In other words,
being gauche was their
it's
religion.
perverse social pretension on the part of the upper classes.
Here's your machine, right?
Yeah. Also, just a machine in a garden. That's a perverse paradox itself.
Right.
Not a pleasing one either.
No, and one that replaces God as the machinist in the realm of nature.
Yeah, I mean, a machine in a garden is a violation of the garden,
Yes.
and a machine is pseudo life, right? That it's imitation life. That's what a machine is by definition, almost.
Yeah.
So
Interesting. Yeah,
it
I suppose the first machine in a garden was Satan in Eden, maybe.
I was thinking the same
that's
thing.
right. Yeah,
Hmm.
I think that's right. It's usurping what is proper, right?
Right. Hmm. Fascinating. Anything else here?
I think that's all of them.
Oh, brilliant. Well,
Sam, that was really cool. Thanks for putting
Dan,
that together.
that's
I
amazing.
was
What an
not expecting that.
exposition. Wow.
Yeah. Just not expecting all of that.
Now, would you could you tell me I'm just interested, and I know you touched upon it, in terms of your personal taste and style, what's your verdict on Wright? I know you said he has the elements of prodigy and he was genius in his productive capacity. And he did have this oppositional stance with European modernism, which seems
Yeah.
to me, in many ways, a almost patriotic heroism.
Yeah.
So I just wanted, what do you think of his buildings? What do you think of him and his contributions as from your perspective as an architect?
Um, I recognize the talent, but I don't admire. I don't think they're beautiful.
Mhm.
Uh, I remember before I had, before I was educated as an architect, like I remember my childhood reaction to him thinking, oh, it looks so old fashioned, or it looks so stilted, or it looks like all too much of one thing. And
Ah,
that's still what I think. I just think, uh, you know, um, Philip Johnson, they hated each other, Philip Johnson and Frank Lloyd Wright, of course.
okay.
And Philip Johnson called him the greatest architect of the 19th century.
Oh,
And in a way, what that besides that being a dig on someone who wanted to be modern, because Frank Lloyd Wright was presenting himself as now modern,
hmm,
um, it points to a kind of like, I don't know, old fashionedness in his work, which I think is there and is true. I think he's doomed to be an outlier, and I think he's doomed to be an outlier by his precisely by his need to be such an individual. So I think of him as the kind of, uh, I mean, Frank Gehry is in his mold, I would say, the architect of the other Guggenheim, the one in Spain.
in
Um,
Bilbao.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. This idea that like, oh, that's definitely him. That's definitely his work. Whereas, let's say Charles Platt, the one who did the villa, it takes a connoisseur to know which ones are Platt, and other people would just say, oh, that's a big nice house. I look kind of Italian or whatever.
Hmm.
And so I tend to, that's what I prefer, because for me that's the role of architecture. Like it should be available to connoisseurs if they want, but to everyone else it should look like, oh, that's what a good house looks like. That's what it should look like to people who don't think of houses, you know.
Well said.
Whereas Frank Lloyd Wright's always putting in front of you, this is my design. So that's childish, you know?
Right. He didn't have to. You know that hagiographical story about Michelangelo about the Pietà, how he went back and signed it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And what
Right.
do you think that
uh,
story illustrates?
I I suspect it well, for me, subjectively, it represents that he was a man of his age in that Renaissance humanism is starting to take over the artist as an instrument of public good and a purveyor of beauty.
Yeah.
And so, as such, when people questioned that if this 21 or 2-year-old could actually form this out of Carrara marble, he could not resist but in a humanistic way sign it.
Yeah, but he's 21.
Exactly right. I know. I know.
And
And,
and and then
and
are his things beautiful? Do they stay beautiful to the end?
yes, always
So
eternally.
see, this is the real, this is how you know.
Mm.
This is how it doesn't matter what a self-promoter he was, although I don't think he was a big self-promoter. Um, it's there in his work. The work tells who the person is. And so that's true of Frank Lloyd Wright. The work reveals him as a bloviator.
Love that. See, this is the dark notes section. When you get called a bloviator by Sam Roche, then we're definitely in dark note territory.
But then, but I don't think he's evil. I don't think he's doing evil like others were, like Le Corbusier, for example,
Yes.
or
And,
Johnson uh, serving that agenda.
and Le Corbusier, as a collectivist, is doing evil.
I think actually my charges against him. I haven't shown any of his work here, but they're more specific. He's an inverter, and he's doing it
Mm.
on purpose. And
Oh,
he's on purpose taking the tenets of good design and inverting them, so that he can remake a new world order in architecture. So
phew,
that's what evil is, inversion.
very much so.
You know.
Well said. Well said. We have taken so much of your time, and you're on the East Coast. Do you think you have the energy to stick around for our People's Delight, the segment Meanwhile in Oak Park, or we can dismiss you to the greater interests of New York and Eastern architecture?
Might I be excused?
You,
Only because it's so late. Because I would like to hear the Oak Park segment, but I would also love to hear it. I'll just have to hear it later if that's all right with you all.
wonderful, Sam.
That
Thank you
works
so
with us.
much.
Sam,
This
really
has
appreciate it.
been a treasure. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very glad to be with you all. A great pleasure. I look forward to next time.
God bless, Sam.
Y'all too.
That was great. Shout out to Sam.
Amazing.
And now it's time
Isn't
to
it, wait,
talk.
can we pause? Isn't it just amazing how God has providentially given people placed people in our lives
He does
through the
conspire.
podcast, through a variety of different connections and concatenations, and then we have these links. How blessed are we?
He knows how to conspire for sure.
Yeah, for our good,
Yes.
right? So, well, speaking about conspiracy, let's get to a village
I
that
will,
is just a
I
growing
want to talk
conspiracy.
about a town that loves Frank Lloyd Wright. Light notes. Here it is.
Meanwhile in Oak Park.
We should go to your gay suburb now.
The people segment. Meanwhile in Oak
Hexagons
Park.
abound. Hexagons abound for Oak Park.
Yeah. Meanwhile in Oak Park, brought to you by Tridentine Brewing. Let's start with this one, actually. West Sub claims it replaced HVAC in 2024 for $1 million.
That seems expensive.
Oak Park has no record of permits being issued for that project.
Uh-oh,
Dun dun
roll.
dun.
Dun dun dun. You better get out there. Some village manager's not getting his palm greased. So
With confirmation that the Illinois Department of Public Health sent staff last week to monitor cooling issues at West Suburban Medical Center comes this question.
damn, it's hot in here.
Did West Sub completely replace its HVAC system on its Oak Park campus in 2024, as it is claimed? Responding to emailed questions from growing community media 2 weeks ago about West Sub admitting 22 patients transferred from Weiss Memorial Hospital, its sister facility, after a complete failure of its HVAC system, the hospital's contracted communications person said West Sub's entire HVAC system had been replaced last year. Asked the cost of that repair, the spokesman said the price was not publicly available.
We don't know. Did they even do the repairs?
However, the next day, when the Sun-Times and Block Club Chicago reported on patient and family complaints of overheated rooms at West Sub, Dr. Manoj Prasad, CEO of Brazilians Healthcare, parent of West Sub and Weiss, was asked at a press conference about conditions at the Oak Park Hospital. He told reporters that West Sub had spent more than $1 million to replace West Sub's HVAC in 2024. The distance between having a new HVAC system in 2024 and major parts of the hospital experiencing room temperatures well into the 80s led Wednesday Journal and the Austin Weekly News to file a Freedom of Information request with the Village of Oak Park, asking for any and all public records of West Sub or its parent polling permits to replace its HVAC in 2024. FOIA and find out. You know what they say. FOIA and find out. The
Yeah.
newsroom also asked for any record of village staff inspecting work done on a new HVAC system last year. The reply to the FOIA was that the village government had not found any records that were responsive to GCM's request. GCM sent an email to the West Sub communications person asking for an interview with Prasad and for any documents detailing the major HVAC project. The communications person replied that his firm no longer worked for Resilience as of last week.
Woo! Interesting timing.
Two emails then sent directly to Prasad from GCM have gone unanswered. And an,
Right in the outbox, right in the delete file.
an initial response from the Illinois Department of Public Health on July 7th confirmed that the agency had sent staff to assess cooling conditions at West Sub in response to complaints. Oak Park's Public Health Department did not participate in the inspection by the Illinois Department of Public Health, according to Dan Yopchik. But the village did advise callers concerned about overheated conditions at West Sub to call the state's Office of Healthcare Regulation Complaint Hotline.
That sounds like you're going to be very happy with the response at that hotline.
Wow,
That's the whole story.
that's it.
So these people are melting.
Yes. It looks like there's continued related. West Sub closes obstetric and neonatal units without notice.
Well, this is a great hospital system they got running here, huh?
Labor and delivery services at West Sub have been in flux for months at West Sub as West Sub separated itself from the longtime maternal services. We talked about this one.
Yes.
Wow, what a disaster.
Yeah. Wow. It's amazing the condition of American healthcare. I mean, talk about on the road to Venezuelan healthcare.
Right. Oak Park to update ordinance with gender affirming care protections.
This is where the money needs to be spent, not on helping people cool off as they're recovering from ailments and other other health problems and difficulties. Let's not do that. Let's refer them to a hotline that no one's going to answer. But
First
no,
reading
let's get our focus on gender affirming care.
First reading of draft ordinance follows community calls for more support for transgender people. Task force may help develop final version. Wow. I've never seen three in a row.
Oh yeah, it's the trifecta right there. Coupled with the ubiquitous anti-hate yard sign.
Oak Park is moving toward adding new language to its human rights ordinance meant to protect the local transgender community.
Why does Oak Park have a human rights ordinance? It's a suburb of Chicago. It acts like it acts like it's the UN or that it's Albania. I don't get it. Or the French government.
Oak Park trustees heard a first reading of the proposed ordinance update at their meeting July 1st. The proposed update follows calls from Oak Park's queer community and their allies, asking the village to pass stronger measures protecting the local transgender community in response, President Donald Trump, it's supposed to say in response to President Donald Trump's executive orders targeting transgender inclusion and healthcare and legislative decisions on gender affirming care in other states. Village trustees expressed an interest in putting legislation on the books that makes Oak Park a safe place for families with transgender children to move when other states pass laws limiting or blocking access to gender affirming care. Village leaders also said they wanted to be careful to strike a balance between providing meaningful protections and drawing unwanted attention to the local transgender community.
Are you joking? All the transgender community wants is attention.
Quote,
That's their
Oak Park
fuel.
is a community that has the resources to be doing more than just making a statement, Village President Vicky Skiman said. We can look at how it is that we can engage further and make sure we are doing this as responsibly as we can.
Do what? What protections?
The new potential ordinance language includes the assurance that no village staff member or village resources could be used to aid any outside investigation into whether a person had accessed gender affirming healthcare in the past.
Okay. What is who's the boogeyman out there that's requiring this?
Quote, no village agent or agency or using resources or assets belonging to the village may conduct any investigation, detain any person, make any arrest, file any criminal charges, cooperate with any other officer, agent, agency, entity, or department, or participate in any prosecution, in which a person or entity is accused of facilitating, providing,
Oh
or
God.
receiving gender affirming care services or products obtained in conformance with the laws of the state of Illinois.
All that's just exonerating parents
Right.
who mutilate their kids
Or doctors.
or correct, or the providers. So this is the big thing behind the scenes,
Right.
right? So when you have those incidents like that Chloe girl who has now claimed, and there are scores of those who received gender affirming care and transitioned, really they were indoctrinated to believe so because they had minor psychoses. And
Yes.
then and then now they're untransitioning or detransitioning. This is the legal cover
Right.
for the indoctrination and mutilation of kids that's
Yeah.
inevitably going to come when, as they age, they realize that they were hunted down and injured because of the sick pathologies of their parents and these healthcare providers and their gender and trans, well, let's call it the religion and cult that they belong to, which they belong.
The village
This
will object to any subpoena or request for information from any out-of-state person or entity for the purposes of investigating a law criminalizing gender-affirming care as set forth in this article or creates civil liability for gender-affirming care.
So you want statistics on what the mutilations have brought about, as a study might wish to gain that information, and how many are detransitioning or who regret their regret their decision or the decision of their parents or guardians to do this to them. You want that? Nope, that's going to be criminal in Oak Park. You're not going to get any help. You might even be prosecuted yourself. This is sick and twisted censorship right here.
Gender affirming healthcare is defined as the quote, broad approach to healthcare and support that recognizes and respects an individual's gender identity, inclu-
Pathology.
including treatments meant to treat a person's gender dysphoria, according to the Human Rights Campaign. When it comes to transgender people, gender affirming care can include medical interventions like puberty blockers, hormone replacement therapy, and surgery.
Yikes.
27 US states currently have bans that block gender affirming care from being prescribed to teenagers, including Indiana, Missouri, and Iowa.
All better places to live than Illinois.
The ordinance follows community discussions from Oak Parkers advocating for the village to adopt a quote transgender sanctuary ordinance in light of those out of state decisions. Aaron McManus, one of the primary resident voices calling for such an ordinance, thanked the village for its work on the issue, but said that this piece of legislation falls short of the goal.
Oh my gosh.
Quote, although this is a good step in that direction, this is not it, McManus said. It does not include things like whistleblower protections, protection for providers, a legal defense fund, a public declaration, civil remedies for harassment, privacy safeguards of records and IT systems, or other technology that can be used like surveillance technology that could actually track people.
Oh wow. Wow, this is full-blown trans totalitarianism right here. Let's do that. This person needs a millstone. Woo!
Wow.
Welcome to Oak Park. And you guys, all those people out there say, "Oh, Gary, Charlie, they're exaggerating the situation for liberal fascism and progressive fascism in Oak Park, woke fascism, right?" Well, you just read a paragraph that of a guy, girl, I don't know what he is, a Z, who is pining for woke fascism.
Wow. That could actually track people. That's the end of that sentence.
It's a great
It's a
start
great,
again.
it's a great start again, but we still have some work to do. And again, I would like to advocate for a public declaration of the sanctuary status that Oak Park could be, especially in these times. Trustee Brian Straw said that he'd like to see the village put together an official task force with experts who can help create the strongest ordinance possible on this issue. Quote, I think bringing a combination of activists and sharp legal minds together to craft a meaningful and effective sanctuary ordinance that will provide protections and have the teeth necessary to ensure that those protections stand up to any challenges that may come before them, I think is a way that we can potentially move this forward, he said. I think this is an absolutely vital and meaningful issue today because the attacks on the trans community and sort of on a national basis are not about to disappear. The ordinance will be redeveloped by village staff and brought back for a second reading before it goes before a village board vote. The next discussion on the topic will likely happen before the board goes on hiatus in August.
Incredible.
Get the incense, Father Tom.
Yep. Yes, sir.
That's the people segment.
Meanwhile in Oak Park.
What would have happened if I'd gone for it and just said, no, I'm gay?
That's a something there. That's a something there. Boy, how far, other than this is just, Oak Park's just a sanitized version of Mayan human sacrifice temples. They're going to build a ziggurat soon. Right? I mean, they're not ripping out hearts, beating hearts from people, but they sure are desirous of ripping out their genitalia and replacing it with something else.
That's probably the most
all they have.
eye-opening quote in Meanwhile in Oak Park history.
Could you
potentially
imagine being a functioning person, relatively functioning person in society, and having said that on the record? Wouldn't, if you were in a daze and you read that you had said that, I'd be like, there's no way, first of all, I said that, and then second, throw me over a bridge. Right? Just to be associated with that quote, much less to have uttered it, would be so self-condemnatory as to call upon someone to take you out. You know, just unbelievable. Unbelievable.
It's all just more big pharma. It's just the decade of this. These silly like
Initiatives.
protections for these
Yes.
medical providers that just keep happening, and just the
Yes. Sure makes me want to. I can't wait to get to my GP next, because they're the geniuses, but they're the ones who are in no ways standing in the way of all of this criminality and all of their official boards and professional credentializing institutions like the American Medical Association, American Pediatric Association. They're all on board with this shit.
yeah.
They're all right on board with it. In
Yeah.
fact, I forget who it was. Was it Casey Means that was talking about how there was a guest on Tom Woods' show about how this guy was a long-time, high-ranking, extraordinarily well-respected surgeon. He belonged to the American Association of Surgeons or something along those lines. He started to question all of the gender surgeries that were going on, and he got booted right away. Just totally blackballed.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just the way it goes.
Well, that's all I got. Great episode. Shout out Sam.
Yes. Yeah. How sullen would your life be if you had to go worship in the Unity Temple?
Oh my goodness. It just
Ooh,
looks just
Made me want to
looking
throw
at it.
up. It made me want to throw up.
Feels
Thank
like
God we
being
get
in the felt like being in the refrigerator aisle
It reminded me of a mausoleum, right? Just a dead,
or the
empty
freezer.
tomb. Yeah, freezer. Yeah, a morgue. It was like a morgue. A really secular,
That's just
very
super symmetrical.
symmetrical morgue.
Very
That's
symmetrical
it.
morgue.
Yeah, yeah. Thank God we have all the vines and the imagery and icons and colors and light and beauty and vaulted arches of and domes of St. Mary's, correct?
Amen.
Amen. All right. Well, thanks for a great episode. Thanks to Sam Roche. And we'll see you next time.
We'll see.